Hey peeps, welcome back to the Majesty of Reason. I'm Joe Schmidt, and today we're going to be looking at Existential Inertia, a response to intellectual conservatism. I first want to begin by thanking Gil and Christopher and Suan for engaging with my work, especially my published work. Oftentimes, academic papers or academic books just kind of collect dust in ivory towers. So it's wonderful to see someone's published work getting discussed like this. So, yeah, thank you for that, and I appreciate it. And of course, I appreciate them and value them immeasurably as people. With that being said, I do not think that their criticisms succeed, as we shall see in this video. And yeah, that's what I'm going to be covering mainly. Going to be covering the criticisms that they level and some of the preliminaries that they raise with regard to the discussion of existential inertia. The first thing that I want to discuss is Gil's explication of existential inertia, because it is important and it does illustrate something that I was discussing and actually really emphasizing in my previous video on existential inertia. So of course, if you guys haven't seen that, you're definitely going to want to check that out. And of course, I'll have my paper linked in the description, so you can read that if you wish as well. But I do want to cover Gil's definition or understanding of existential inertia that he lays out at the beginning of the discussion, because I have some comments to make on it.
But the first view is existential inertia. And so that's just how I define it, is that after an object is caused to exist, it will continue to exist without a concurrent sustaining cause unless impeded. So what that basically means is that existential inertia is not talking about the initial moment in which that object exists. God could cause that object for all they know. It's compatible with that, at least some version of theism. What they want to say is that, well, after it exists, once it's been given existence, then it can continue to exist without it being constantly caused to exist at that moment.
So here is just the slide that I had and discussed in the previous video on existential inertia. This is kind of giving a variety of different theses or a variety of different ways of spelling out existential inertia, right? And now Gil did do a good job of articulating that there are different domains of quantification, right? Are we just going to have a sort of global thesis or an entitative thesis or a fundamental entitative thesis? But, I do think that there was some lack of clarity in how he was expounding it there. Especially at the beginning, he was mentioning how, he was simply saying how, like, objects once caused to exist, just continue to exist without a sort of continuously concurrent sustaining cause. Now, I do wish to emphasize, though, that sort of categorical denial of, sustaining causes with respect to concrete objects is not an essential or integral part of existential inertia. And the reason is because we can restrict the domain of quantification of the thesis even further. That is to say, we don't even have to apply it to concrete objects as such. We can apply it only to the fundamental concrete objects. That is to say, objects that are sort of at the base level or foundational level of reality, kind of like the ultimate level of reality. You can think of it like that. They don't obtain in virtue of any more fundamental things. They aren't grounded in other things. They aren't caused by other things. They're sort of ontologically, if not temporally, prior to non-fundamental things or all other things. So if we restrict our thesis in this manner, namely that only the fundamental temporal concrete objects have existential inertia or persist in the absence of a continuously concurrent sustaining cause, well then that is perfectly compatible with a whole host of entities, even concrete objects, requiring sustaining causes of their existence, of their very being, at every single moment at which they exist, right? And I just don't think this was sufficiently appreciated in Gil's presentation. That's not to say that Gil said anything wrong. It's just to say that there needs to be, I think, much more clarity and precision in discussion of the thesis itself. So let's flesh out this account a little bit further. And it's one according to which there is at least one foundational or fundamental temporal concrete object. Now, this object or objects exist of metaphysical necessity. Okay? So they are necessary beings. Now, they are also temporal. And since they're temporal and they are metaphysically necessary, well, then it simply follows that they inertially persist. And since they're fundamental, it follows that they inertially persist in the absence of some sort of sustaining cause. And so we have these necessary beings, or necessary being, at the foundation of temporal reality, and these things are themselves temporal according to this particular account of existential inertia. Again, this isn't the account, or this isn't the only account, but it's one account, and it's one that I slightly lean towards. We have these fundamental concrete objects, or object, which persist of metaphysical necessity and exist of metaphysical necessity, and they go on to explain non-fundamental things. Perhaps even explain them moment by moment by moment, right? So I leave open the relation that obtains, the explanatory relation between the fundamental and non-fundamental concrete objects and processes and so on. The relation might be one of sustaining causation. That is perfectly compatible with my existential inertia thesis. It also could be one of constitution. So perhaps the fundamental things go on to constitute the less fundamental things of our experience, say. It's also compatible with the relation obtaining being a grounding relation. So they don't constitute them or cause them, but they sort of non-causally explain them. So they ground them. They are that in virtue of which the non-fundamental things obtain, and so on, right? So this particular account, leaves open the precise relation between the fundamental concrete objects and the non-fundamental concrete objects. And it could easily be one of sustaining causation. And in fact, this account is actually perfectly compatible with every single contingent concrete object requiring a continuously concurrent sustaining cause of its very being or existence at any moment at which it exists. Precisely because, right, the fundamental entities under this account are metaphysically necessary, and the non-fundamental entities under this account could easily be contingent. Right? So, perhaps all the fundamental concrete objects are necessary because they're uncaused, and then every contingent thing is caused. It's explained, even at a moment at which it exists, by one or more things in the fundamental layer of reality, in conjunction perhaps with other contingent causal factors operating and so on, right? And so what that means is that we could even have an existential inertia thesis even when we have every single contingent thing, depending at any moment at which it exists, on a sustaining cause, and that would be perfectly compatible with existential inertia. Again, precisely because existential inertia is just a thesis either about concrete objects or some subset of them persisting without requiring a sustaining cause. And under the account that I've been spelling out, it's sort of the fundamental entities, the fundamental concrete objects, which are that subset of temporal concrete objects, and those are the ones that persist without a sustaining cause. So I'm not, particularly die-hard committed to this. I just think it's maybe one of the more plausible accounts of existential inertia. And again, I want to stress maybe, this is still an area of active research. But my point in bringing this up is that it might help to avert potential criticisms that Gil and Christopher and Suan might level later on in their video. And it also helps to clarify and precisify the point Gil was just making at the beginning of the video, because I don't think it sufficiently captures all the nuances within the existential inertia thesis. Again, that's just a little reminder concerning the various different theses under existential inertia and how merely undermining or refuting or objecting to one of them doesn't amount to undermining or refuting or objecting to another one, right? And it's also crucial to keep this in mind also when we're evaluating different objections, because some of them might not even touch, the best versions of existential inertia. So the next thing that I want to cover is Gil's summary of the significance of existential inertia. So let's get into that next.
Chris was saying really just hit it home, I think, in a way, just how essential this teaching is to the Christian faith. Because what happens here, if you kind of adopt this view that existential inertia is something that's possible, at least possible, you kind of have an idea of God as a watchmaker, kind of like a theistic view, in which God just simply creates the watch and then it's already wound up, so it continues operating without God's concurrent sustaining of it. And I think this is a pretty dangerous view for Christians to adopt. I've seen some Christians especially more of the theistic personalists, I don't want to overgeneralize though, some of them at least, kind of have a tendency to be more accepting of this.
Now, as you can probably tell from what I've already said on behalf of existential inertia and the various domains of quantification that we can build into it, what Gil says here isn't quite correct, because there are both naturalist-friendly and theist-friendly, including Christian-friendly versions of existential inertia. Why is that? Well, because existential inertia, in its most general form, says that temporal concrete objects, or some subset of temporal concrete objects, persist in existence without requiring some sort of sustaining, concurrent cause, or efficient cause of their existence, right? And so what that means is that there very well could be a demand, a requirement of sustaining causes for an entire category of things, perhaps every single thing except for one thing, right? So perhaps there is a single foundation, a single source of all. that creates and sustains everything. But this single foundation is, number one, a fundamental concrete object. Number two, it's temporal, right? And so nothing is going to further create or sustain this thing, so it is going to be inertially persisting, but it is going to be accounting for the existence and or persistence of everything else. And so I just want to emphasize, now, of course, not every inertialist is going to hold that. This is just one kind of existential inertia because it says that a subset of temporal concrete objects has existential inertia, namely that one singular foundation, right? But I just do want to emphasize that existential inertia is perfectly theist-friendly and it's perfectly naturalist-friendly. Obviously not for every single theist. I mean, classical theists aren't gonna have it, and not every naturalist. And so it is simply false to say that existential inertia would demand a sort of watchmaker view of God or a deistic view of God, right? It simply doesn't, right? Again, precisely because existential inertia says either temporal concrete objects or some subset of them persist inertially. That is to say, persist without a sustaining cause or, continuously concurrent sustaining cause of their existence and persistence. Now, this does, of course, raise the question of what might this temporal inertial foundation be? Well, of course, there are naturalist-friendly and theist-friendly options. So, for instance, we might think that the foundation is a collection of fundamental particles. So this is a kind of fundamental base or ground layer of reality that explains, in some sense, less fundamental layers of reality, but yet does not itself have some further outside explanation of itself. So in that sense, it's the fundamental layer of reality. It's kind of like the ground layer. It's the foundation of reality. You can kind of think of it like a foundation. So one naturalist-friendly option is, of course, to say that they are at reality's bottom level. It's just fundamental particles, and they are the things that persist in existence without requiring a continuously concurrent sustaining cause. Someone might say that they are necessary beings. Someone might say that they are contingent beings. It'll depend on, their other commitments. And they are likely to go on to say that these fundamental particles inertially persist, and then they go on to explain the existence and or persistence of non-fundamental things. So perhaps the means by which they explain them, right, there's a kind of explanatory relation there. And again, this account of existential inertia leaves open what that precise explanatory relation might be, right? It might be a grounding relation. It might be a constitution relation. It might be a sustaining cause relation. Again, it leaves it open, for the most part, this account of existential inertia, the kind of fundamental entitative thesis, the one that I'm, kind of elaborating upon here, it leaves that precise relation open. But here's one naturalist-friendly option, is to hold that there are fundamental particles and perhaps their various causal powers, of course, and their various interactions with one another. The second option is, of course, mass energy. Now, of course, how you spell that out is going to be different depending on your views in the philosophy of science. But one might take cue from conservation theses and conservation laws with respect to mass energy in formulating this particular naturalist-friendly version of the fundamental entitative thesis for existential inertia. Again, these are kind of just different models of the temporal inertial foundation. Another one is, of course, one or more fundamental quantum fields. So, that might be a relatively neat picture of reality for a naturalist, right? There's this one fundamental quantum field that inertially persists, and it explains the existence and or persistence of non-fundamental things, perhaps by constituting them, or perhaps by grounding them, or what have you. So that's another naturalist-friendly one. Another naturalist-friendly one is maybe it's just a collection of mereological simples. And so a friend of mine actually recently sent me this dissertation entitled Endurance and Parthood by Matteo Benocchi. Matteo Benocchi, I think that's how you pronounce it. And so it's really recent. That's July 2018, and the author doesn't do it explicitly, but defends a kind of existential inertia, basically a world picture on which existential inertia would be true. He defends endurantism and the thesis that reality at its fundamental layer is mereological simples. So that's yet another one. Those mereological simples will have inertial persistence according to this account, and so on. Yet another account, you could take a substantivalist view of space-time. So you treat space-time as a substance in itself, and you could treat that as the foundation. of reality, the fundamental layer. Indeed, you might take the cosmos as a whole, right? You could go Jonathan Schaeffer, and you could take a kind of priority monism, but most people don't want to do the kind of monism aspect. All we need is that, maybe space-time itself is the substance that underlies other things. It itself doesn't have a continuously concurrent sustaining cause, but it itself might explain in some form or other entities within space-time, say, or other substances. So that's another picture that one can use in developing their fundamental entitative existential inertia thesis. So all the previous ones were really naturalist-friendly versions of the fundamental entitative inertial thesis, but this one is a theist-friendly and even a Christian-friendly one, right? So you could have a view on which there is only one fundamental concrete entity, namely God. And God is temporal, and he's a necessary being, and hence you kind of get existential inertia for free because he's the ground of everything else. He explains everything else. He causes everything apart from himself to exist or to be, even at any moment at which they exist, right? So God doesn't have a continuously concurrent sustaining cause, clearly, but, he nevertheless persists, and because he's temporal, right? And so he would have inertial persistence on this particular account, right? And so as long as you have a temporal God, which bunches of theists do, bunches of theists and Christians, like William Lane Craig, Josh Rasmussen, Ryan Mullins, and countless others, right? So long as you have a temporal view of God, according to which there is succession in the life of God, you're going to have a kind of existential inertia thesis. It's not going to be, of course, as robust, as it were, as the global entitative thesis that some naturalists are going to want to employ, right? Some naturalists are just going to want to say, no, even less fundamental concrete objects persist in existence. They don't have sustaining causes either. And that of course, would be incompatible with, Christianity and neoclassical theism and panentheism and so on, right? But that is not absolutely essential to existential inertia, and hence it's false to say that existential inertia is incompatible with Christianity or, neoclassical theism or panentheism or what have you, right? Now, granted, Gill may have just been targeting the global entitative thesis. Fair enough, but then he didn't specify that in the beginning, and we need to bring much clarity and precision in these discussions, in these topics. So, in short, existential inertia, in its broadest articulation, simply holds that temporal concrete objects, or some subset of them, persist in existence without requiring a continuously concurrent, sustaining efficient cause. And as such, existential inertia is perfectly compatible with Christianity, theism, deism, atheism, naturalism, and so on. And again, you're going to have to get a more precise specification of which particular brand or which particular version of existential inertia you want to target if you're going to mount an argument against it. See my previous video on Existential Inertia, a User's Guide for more on this. One might object to what I've been saying here, and they're like, hey, Joe, listen, you literally write in your paper, quote, as I characterize it, EIT is necessarily concrete objects, 1, persist in existence once in existence without requiring a continuously concurrent sustaining cause of their existence, and 2, cease to exist only if caused to do so, end quote. So, yeah, I do write that in the paper, but, if I could go back 11 months and tell myself, maybe to even have even greater clarity. But I would actually make even further distinctions, make even further delineations, if I could go back to myself and, slap myself in the face or something. We have to keep in mind that, I wrote this paper probably 11 months or so ago, right? And people refine their views further in 11 months. I was a little first semester freshman back then. And so, yeah, I probably could have been more refined, shall we say, in my presentation. But look, you can actually see in my footnote that I was anticipating some elements of what I'm saying here, because, I say in that footnote that an alternative formulation quantifies not over concrete objects simpliciter, but instead on a subset of them, right? And of course, I was thinking in naturalist terms then, so I said the fundamental underlying physical stuff of the material world, whatever its intrinsic nature, right? So again, I left open its intrinsic nature, so it could be a quantum field, it could be mereological simples, it could be space-time, it could be, particles or what have you, right? or mass energy or whatever. And so under this formulation, I wrote, the inertialist holds that there is something possessing existential inertia out of which the composite physical objects of the world are constructed. And so then there I'm actually pointing to this kind of explanatory relation that I've been specifying that obtains between the fundamental and the non-fundamental. Now, in this footnote, I am saying, of course, that under this formulation, I only kind of give a constitution relation. That's what I meant by constructed. But now I want to leave it more opener. I was going to say I want to leave it opener. Yes. I want to leave it even more open, right? I want to allow grounding. I want to allow constitution. I want to allow sustaining causation. All we need is some subset of concrete objects that have existential inertia. So Gill goes on to articulate a number of arguments in favor of existential inertia. And for the most part, he did an excellent job articulating a variety of different motivations for existential inertia. Now, of course, in discussions like this, we cannot be exhaustive or comprehensive or even representative, right? So there are going to be a lot of arguments, and this isn't to fault him, right? There are going to be a lot of different arguments that they're not discussing in the video, but which one might level in favor of existential inertia. And again, that's not a criticism of them or the video. It's just to help you guys recognize that discussions like this are far more complex, or debates like this are far more complex than YouTube discussions can let on. Now, with that being said, I do want to make a few comments on some of the articulations of different arguments that Gill proffered. So let's get into what he said there, and I will provide some comments on that.
And the last argument I think they would give, which is pretty common, is that they would say, well, there just are no good arguments for divine conservation. It seems to beg the question against existential inertia by assuming some other principle, by assuming there's only two principles of being, or what have you. So that seems to be a problem. And so none of the divine conservation accounts seem to exclude existential inertia in principle, at least according to them. And so the second problem, too, in addition to that, is that it seems to presuppose a controversial metaphysical account of the nature of substances. So I think Audie kind of put this best when he was kind of addressing Phaser. He says, whether hylomorphism is correct depends in part on whether things have existential inertia in the first place. So you can't argue from the way that something is that it's hylomorphic, that has form and matter, therefore existential inertia doesn't exist, because you're assuming that hylomorphism is true. But if existential inertia is actually true, then hylomorphism proves to be false, because those aren't the only two principles of physical beings. And so that would be a quick kind of summary of the arguments for existential inertia.
So the first thing that I want to say by way of response to this particular articulation of, what someone might say on behalf of existential inertia is that while I recognize that Gill is simply articulating what someone might say on its behalf, I do want to emphasize in the most resounding voice that I would never claim that there are no good arguments in favor of the doctrine of divine conservation, right? That is something that is so utterly inimical to my entire outlook on life, on people, on argumentation, on rationality. And, you guys who are familiar with my channel you guys should know why I take very strong issue with any claim to the effect that, for the most part, any thesis doesn't have any good arguments in favor of it. I think that's an objectification of one's own sight. I also think that arguments are, well, first of all, their success is going to depend on the dialectical context, but it's also going to, the argument's plausibility or its being successful will very likely depend on the person's background beliefs, on their various, intellectual seemings, their, this whole concoction of their position on the epistemic landscape. For me, I want to make it, and I know I'm not attributing this accusation to Gill, right? I'm not saying that he's accusing me of saying this. I just want to clarify that I would never make any claim to the effect that there are no good arguments for the doctrine of divine conservation. I think that is a ludicrous claim, and there are no good arguments for that claim. No, I'm just kidding. Okay, so jokes aside, I also want to mention that in my paper, I discussed that criticism of the argument from hylomorphism. Okay, so Phaser originally leveled an argument, at least one argument, I should say, against existential inertia on the basis of hylomorphism. Now, I gave about 4 or 5 criticisms of that in my paper. Now, the first thing that I said was that if the argument is successful, then all it would show is that if hylomorphism is true, then existential inertia is false. And so what we can do, by way of my first response to that argument, is we can say, okay, let's just suppose that this argument succeeds, okay? well, then all that would show is that if hylomorphism is true, then existential inertia is false. But as Paul Audi points out, right, he says, well, hold on a second, like that doesn't show that existential inertia is false. What that shows is that the truth of hylomorphism depends on whether or not existential inertia is true or false, and hence there's still this more fundamental question of whether or not existential inertia is true, right? So it's that whole kind of one person's modus ponens is another's modus tollens, or trollens if you like my shirt that I sometimes wear. I do want to emphasize that that is not the only response that I would give to that argument, because I don't think that that first conditional, or that first antecedent even holds, that if the argument succeeds, even assuming hylomorphism is true, right, I don't think that the argument would even succeed under that, because I think it ignores conditional potencies, I think it ignores a whole host of other things. And so I actually would not agree with that conditional that if hylomorphism is true, then existential inertia is false. No, what I would say is that if Feser's particular argument succeeds, then if hylomorphism is true, then existential inertia is false. But I don't agree with that antecedent in the first place. I don't think his argument succeeds, and that's irrespective of whether or not hylomorphism is true, because I think he has other logical errors in there, by my estimation, of course. So I actually would not agree with what Gil is saying. I mean, I know he's sort of just briefly articulating it and so on, but I strongly disagree that if hylomorphism is true, then existential inertia is false. I completely dispute that. And so it does not suffice as an argument against existential inertia to provide an argument for hylomorphism. Because again, that's going to be assuming that Feser's argument succeeds in the first place in showing that the two are incompatible. And I don't think it succeeds in the first place in showing that the two are incompatible. And so before going on to discuss some arguments for existential inertia that I would like to highlight for you guys, I do want to say, like, as with disambiguating models of God, right, like neoclassical theism, classical theism, panentheism, pantheism, and so on, deism, if you want, a further articulation of that, check out my video, Why Am I Agnostic? And a bunch of other my videos, of course. But as with those cases of disambiguating models of God, right, which arguments for or against existential inertia we find convincing will depend on our favorite account or version of existential inertia, right? Like, the points about simplicity might not carry over for someone who's, for instance, an existential inertialist in the kind of fundamental entitative kind if they are, for instance, a neoclassical theist, because they're also going to have this qualitatively different being in their ontology. They're also going to have the sustaining causes and so on. So although it's a kind of existential inertia, it doesn't have the simplicity benefits that the full-blown global entitative thesis would have for, say, a naturalist. So that's not to say that the naturalist is correct or that the theist is incorrect. It's just to say that, once again, the arguments even for and against existential inertia will likely depend on which version or account of existential inertia that we're talking about, which of course, raises the question as to what is my favorite account. Well, I don't quite know. I lean towards perhaps a fundamental entitative thesis of some sort. So there's some foundation or other. It persists, and most likely it is a metaphysically necessary entity or collection of entities. And so it's temporal and it persists necessarily, and it's the foundation, it's the fundamental layer of reality, so that kind of gives us existential inertia for free. And then it goes on to explain non-fundamental things. And I don't know which of those three, the constitution or the grounding or the sustaining causation, which one of those three explanatory relations I want to include in this quote-unquote favorite account. But I don't quite have a favorite account, but, if I were pushed one direction, I would probably say that the fundamental entitative thesis, where the foundation is a necessary temporal being, and then goes on to explain non-fundamental things, I think that's probably my favorite. But anyway, this is all, I still need to research it further, so. I am going to be very brief here. First of all, Gil already went over this one, but the kind of intuitive seeming that things just simply persist without requiring some sort of thing that continuously bestows them being. Obviously, it's not the strongest argument, but, phenomenal conservatism, if something seems to you to be the case, that you at least have prima facie feasible evidence for its being the case. So, at least for someone who does share that seeming, it's going to provide some evidence for them. Second of all, you have both qualitative and quantitative simplicity. Gil went over that nicely in his, articulation of the arguments. You also have a wide range of explanatory advantages. So, for instance, one of the accounts, the metaphysical accounts of existential inertia, is that it's not a primitive metaphysical necessity. It actually obtains in virtue of the transtemporal causal relations among different temporal moments within the life of a persisting object. So, we do know that past things can and do legitimately explain present things. And so if we have a perfectly legitimate model of past explanations, and if we know that past things can explain present things, well, then we could arguably just say, well, let's use that in our account of persistence, and let's simply use Occam's razor to shave off any further requirement of some sort of thing in addition to the past explanations, right, in terms of the immediately temporally prior state and existence of something, say. So that's how again, these are brief sketches, but that's how that argument goes. The second and third one is that, we don't observe instant or chaotic annihilation of concrete objects, and we also only observe concrete objects going out of existence. I shouldn't have said annihilate, but going out of existence, ceasing to exist, only when sort of causally destroyed, when there's some causal factor that comes and destroys them. And so, we might think that existential inertia provides the best explanation for that. Again, I'm not going to go into the details here. Gil went over the next two as well, and no, we don't observe any clear-cut cases of sustaining causes. I go over some of them in my paper, which will be linked in the description. And I argue that, strictly speaking, they're not sustaining efficient causes. Also, the truth of existential inertia makes good sense of our explanatory and scientific reasoning and our sort of ordinary common sense explanatory practices. And then finally, Gil also went over this one in the video, diachronic identity. The fourth one that I have on there is modal epistemology. So Gil also kind of alluded to this when he was discussing the argument from intuition, as it were, for existential inertia. But we can use our best modal epistemological tools. So, we might sort of bring to bear our best modal epistemological tools in arguing at least for the possibility of existential inertia. Again, these are mights. I'm not saying I endorse every single one of these arguments. I'm just giving you a broad outline, just as they were in their original video, that is to say, Gil and Christopher and Suan. Yeah, so that's the fifth one, a Bayesian argument from persistence, right? So that one's, Gil mentioned that one, and he definitely did do it justice, for a short summary. But I do want to say that it's much more complex than the short summary can let on, and that's not Gil's fault. It's just the fault of the short amount of time that he has to articulate it. But this is a paper that I have under review right now. I can't really say any further details about that, but I figured I'd just share with you guys the abstract. I basically go over this Bayesian argument, and justify its premises and show why it does provide, I think, quite strong reason to think that a particular kind of existential inertia thesis, I say conservation naturalism, but that's beside the point, over classical theism. So I discuss reason-based action. I go into just a lot of things. Classical theism's probabilistic resources in accounting for persistence, the world's persistence, in relation to various existential inertia hypotheses, and I focus in particular on a hypothesis that I call conservation naturalism. So, I hope, fingers crossed that gets published, but I just want to flag that I am developing this in much greater detail, and there are many intricacies that simply cannot be sufficiently captured in Gil's short summation of the argument in question. Also, kind of explicability argument for existential inertia. I went over that near the end of my video. Again, it was a sort of brief articulation of it and a rough sketch, but I went over that near the end of my video with Graham Oppy, entitled, it was on arguments. It was one of my first videos. It was on arguments, and it said something like, with existential inertia as a bonus, right? So I went over an explicability argument in there. The seventh one is arguments against timelessness. So there are lots of different arguments, a variety of different arguments against divine timelessness, but even more broadly, against there being any kind of concrete object that that is timeless, but yet can stand in causal relations to a genuinely dynamic creation or a genuinely dynamic reality. But needless to say that if we have an argument against timelessness, right, well then, if there's going to be some sort of foundation to reality, well then clearly it's going to be temporal. And so we already get a kind of fundamental temporal thing. And since it's fundamental, it's not obtaining in virtue of any more fundamental, entities or facts that explain it. And hence we kind of get existential inertia for free. At least the fundamental entitative thesis at least, right? Because there's going to be at least some subset of concrete objects that persist in existence without requiring some sort of continuously concurrent sustaining cause of their existence. So there are lots of different arguments against timelessness, and I advise you guys to check out a bunch of the different video. I mean, I've done a lot of different videos wherein different arguments are sprinkled throughout them. So I can't really, pinpoint you to anyone in particular right here and right now. But so that's really all I'm going to say on, behalf of the various arguments for existential inertia. Now, before getting into their particular objections to existential inertia, I do want to make one preliminary comment on one of their preliminary comments to their the objections that they're going to raise. It essentially concerns the metaphysical backdrop of at least some of their criticisms. So let's go into that next.
So for those, I guess for those of you who are watching this video who find things that Gil or I say to be implausible because it assumes a lot of background metaphysics that you're not on board with, what I'd say about that is there's not much to be done with about it unless we want to make this video 30 hours long and we build everything up from the ground. We're going to have to what we're trying to do here is articulate what the Thomist approach broadly is. We're going to have to assume some background Thomist material.
Now, I certainly agree that this is a valuable approach to the issue, right? I mean, just looking at how different metaphysical systems or different worldviews, as it were, would respond to existential inertia, or perhaps would be able to incorporate it, right? Now, there is, of course, one big limitation of this approach, however. And the limitation is one that, Christopher himself was recognizing in that clip, which is, or at least he was pointing towards, is that, pretty much no existential inertialist is going to adopt Thomism, right? So, there is a sense in which, we're probably going to have to get into that 30-hour preliminaries in order to really flesh out all of this, all of these objections and arguments in order to actually have them succeed, right? Because, if the inertialist doesn't hold to Thomism, as for instance I do not, and, other proponents of existential inertia do not, it's going to be difficult to mount an argument that is such that it should, get us to abandon our positions. And similarly, of course, if they hold Thomism, whereas we don't, it might be difficult for us to mount an argument that they ought to abandon their positions. Again, because, we're not going to be able to, unless we do that sort of prior metaphysics, we're not going to be able to appeal to kind of, in general, we're not going to be able to appeal to kind of neutral metaphysical principles upon which we can both agree in that case. So it is a pretty big limitation, and it isn't a limitation for all arguments, I should say that. So for instance, in here, I actually just do a sort of Bayesian comparison with the Thomists' own resources, their own, according to their own worldview, and then I look at the conservation naturalist, and I look at their probabilistic resources in accounting for the world's persistence. And so in this particular argument, for instance, it's neutral on the metaphysics at play. It's completely neutral. And so what I'm saying here doesn't apply to all arguments, of course, but it's probably going to apply to many arguments, that it's going to depend on your prior metaphysics, and hence it's going to be very dialectically limited. But I did want to mention that this limitation is not going to be applying to every single argument in the dialectical context. And then there's one final remark, of course, that I want to make, which is just that, I do want to emphasize that this is a very limited, and again, this is no criticism of Christopher and Gil, but it's a very limited approach, right? Because, it seems, right, I was thinking of this analogy, right? Like if you're trying to object to existential inertia on the basis of Thomism or Thomistic principles, that it just reminds me of the criticism that Alvin Plantinga raises against the doctrine of divine simplicity. So, of course, famously, Alvin Plantinga argued against the divine simplicity by saying, look, divine simplicity claims that God is identical to all of his attributes. He doesn't have a kind of multiplicity or internal differentiation of attributes, and hence he's identical to anything that he has. He's identical to his attributes, right? And so he goes on to say, well, then that would literally make God identical to an abstract object, and hence he would be causally effete, and so that's just absurd, and so we should reject divine simplicity. That's what Plantinga says. Now, the response to that, and I think it's a good response, I think the response succeeds on behalf of the divine simplicity proponent, is to say, whoa, hold on a second. You, Mr. Plantinga or Dr. Plantinga, you are foisting upon classical theism your own contemporary analytic Platonic account of properties, according to which properties are things that concrete objects stand in exemplification relations to, and the properties are Platonic abstracta, you are foisting that upon classical theism, and that's a foreign metaphysical framework to classical theism, right? So you can't legitimately claim to have done away with divine simplicity just by foisting upon this foreign metaphysical framework on it. I mean, of course, under that metaphysical framework, it's going to look absurd. So it reminds me. This approach that Gill and Christopher might be taking in their objections. I haven't gotten there yet, but this preliminary note worries me about that. It just reminds me of this objection to the doctrine of divine simplicity, right? Because, I mean, of course, if you're taking this contemporary analytic Platonic account of properties that Plantinga does, well, then of course you're going to see the doctrine of divine simplicity as absurd. Similarly, we might say that, well, I mean, if you're going to take a Thomistic metaphysics, well, then of course you're going to say existential inertia is false, right? It's like, so I don't know. I just want to emphasize that this is a very limited dialectical context here, and as Christopher was mentioning and emphasizing, a proper investigation of this would take well over 30 hours, definitely longer than that. To my mind, I'm predicting that many of these objections are going to sound to the inertialist just as Plantinga's objection sounds to the proponent of divine simplicity, right? They're just going to be like, no, you're just foisting a foreign metaphysical framework onto this thesis. Okay, so now we're going to be moving into the particular objections that they level against existential inertia. Now, of course, I won't be playing clips of all or even most of their arguments against existential inertia. That would make my video inordinately longer than it is. So instead, I will simply summarize the argument or arguments that they give against existential inertia, and then provide my replies. So they begin with Gill, and he gives 3 broad arguments against existential inertia, and I don't think any of them succeed, and so I'll go through each one of them and argue that they don't succeed. So Gill first gives an analogical argument. He says, just imagine a kind of character, and this character, right, you can think about it, right, but once you stop thinking about it, right, the character is just going to cease to exist. It ceases immediately upon removing your thought, upon thinking about something else, or let's say if someone comes along and kills you, right? So the character is clearly sustained in being by you or your thought or what have you. Now, I don't think this argument works. Why is that? Well, because thought or imaginings or, things like that, those things are processes, right? They're not concrete objects. It's not something like an apple or a quark or an electron, right? These things are processes. It's more like singing a song or Beethoven's First Symphony or walking along the beach. It's more like that because these things are processes. You're engaged in a process of imagination, and hence it's no surprise that the process exists only insofar as you are engaged in that thinking process, right? Processes seem to be the kinds of things that by definition require some kind of sustaining operation for their continual performance, right? I mean, if I sing a song, right, the moment I stop singing, the song, understood as the continual operation of producing new notes, immediately ceases, right? Now, of course, to be sure, the vibrations produced by the song continue in existence as compressions and rarefactions of air molecules long after I cease singing. But the process of the song itself, that is to say, continually producing new notes, that itself ceases, right, immediately upon me stopping singing, right? And this is relevantly different from concrete objects, which do not obviously and definitionally involve some kind of continual operation distinct from themselves for their preservation in being, right? And so processes, of course, no one denies that processes require some sort of sustaining cause, and hence it's no surprise that the imagined character ceases immediately upon the absence of thought. And the question is, do concrete objects behave that way? And no justification was provided for that. No reason was provided as to why concrete objects are relevantly similar to or behave identically with processes with respect to their continual existence. Simply wasn't justified. And, moreover, we actually have a nice explanation, a nice account deriving from the very nature of processes that can, disambiguate between these two cases and see why in one case it's obvious that you need a kind of continual operation for the continued performance of the process, whereas in the other case, it's not at all obvious. And of course, no justification was presented as to why existence of concrete objects is like a process, like a continually produced song, say, as opposed to behaving inertially. Simply wasn't proven. So, by my lights, that argument does not succeed. Let's go on to the second one. Gill then tried to propose certain examples of sustaining causes, like neurological structures, which are in turn sustained by chemical structures, in turn sustained by the atomic structure, and so on, the particles and the quantum structure, right? And he said it's evident that we observe sustaining causes. He also says oxygen and hydrogen in water are concurrent sustaining causes. Well, not really, no. Those aren't efficient sustaining causes, which is precisely what we're talking about when we're talking about existential inertia. We're talking about efficient causes of the very existence of something. We're not talking about the materials out of which it is composed. We're talking about sustaining causes of the very existence or being of something, and hence it's an efficient causal relation. That's what the entire debate of existential inertia is about. And the oxygen and the hydrogen in the water are not sustaining efficient causes. Neither are the neurological structures and chemical structures and atomic structures efficient sustaining causes. Why is that? Well, because they're merely parts of the substance. They make up the substance. They are merely material causes. They are not efficient causes, and hence he has simply failed to provide any examples of efficient sustaining causes, which is precisely what needs to be provided in the context of existential inertia. Moreover, there are, of course, Aristotelian reasons for thinking that parts of things cannot be efficient sustaining causes of the wholes that they compose. One reason is because parts of substances only exist virtually. That is to say, they don't exist actually, because their life is, as it were, subsumed into the life of the whole substance. Right? That's one way of putting it. And because they exist virtually, they only exist as a kind of potency, right? They don't exist actually. It follows that they cannot efficiently, causally sustain the wholes of which they are parts. Why is that? Well, because only things that exist in actuality can actually have any causal power so as to sustain efficiently something else in being, right? This is precisely what Phaser and other people who argue, for instance, from the argument from change. That's precisely their premise, right? Only something that is actual can efficiently causally actualize something else. And then another reason why you can't adduce parts of substances as efficient sustaining causes of those substances is because, again, under Aristotelianism, parts are in some sense less ontologically fundamental than the wholes that they compose, right? So Aristotelianism, as you guys probably know, is a kind of like a substance-first ontology, right? So substances are kind of the fundamental building blocks, and parts of substances kind of have their identity derivative from the whole substance. And in that sense, they are ontologically posterior in some sense, or less fundamental than them. In which case, they cannot causally explain or account for, right, why those substances are in reality in the first place, right? Precisely because they already presuppose that the substances exist in a more fundamental way in order for them to exist as parts of those substances. So, for instance, something's being my kidney seems to presuppose me as a kind of substantial whole, that this kidney kind of is subsumed into my life and directed toward various ends and so on, right? And so that's yet another reason why we cannot say that parts of substances can efficiently causally sustain the wholes of which they are composed, right? And so we have abundant reason to think that parts cannot efficiently causally sustain their wholes, and hence him appealing to oxygen and hydrogen and neurological structures and chemical structures and so on. These are simply wrong-headed. Now, of course, I included that little Trump thing. I'm not like making fun of anyone. I'm just I'm doing this for kicks and giggles, guys. Now, Gill did seem to recognize this sort of at one point. He said, he said something like, "Now I recognize that this isn't efficient causality." He said that, and I'm like, well, like, then it's irrelevant. It's irrelevant to existential inertia. No existential inertialist would deny that material causality is a real feature of the world in the sense of things composing other things, unless they're a mereological nihilist. This is just completely irrelevant to the existential inertia thesis, which is explicitly cast in terms of efficient causality. We are talking about whether or not things have an efficient cause of their being at any moment at which they exist. And hence, him conceding that these aren't efficient causes is simply to concede that his argument fails. So now let's go on to the third reason that Gill gives. Okay, so his third argument derives from contingent things requiring explanations. Right, yes, plausibly. So he says a contingent nature requires an explanation, but, the contingent nature remains contingent even after it comes into existence. And so it's still going to require an explanation of its continued existence even after it's come into existence, right? He says, quote, so it's not as though it doesn't need an explanation now just because something brought it into existence, end quote. Now, the response is just that this just simply misunderstands existential inertia. Existential inertia does not say that the contingent nature presently has no explanation, is utterly inexplicable. There are a variety of different ways that you can explain it. And, they're not, it persists just because. Like, that's not what it is. This point is granted by existential inertialists. They grant that, yes, we can grant that the contingent nature is still contingent even after it comes into existence, and hence still needs an explanation after it comes into existence. But it's just metaphysical prejudice, so they argue, to think that the only explanation of the continued existence could be had in terms of a concurrent, sustaining, efficient cause of its very being at any moment at which it exists. There are lots of other ways that we can explain it. So Graham Oppy is going to explain it like, one, something brought it into existence, and two, nothing came along to destroy it up until time t, and hence that's going to remove mystery as to why it has persisted until t. Now, of course, you might raise further questions about explaining things further, and we can go down that hole. But to say that this isn't an explanation at all is simply false, and it's not a just because answer. And of course, there are a whole host of other metaphysical accounts as well. I go over, in my paper that's co-authored with Oppy that is under review right now, I go over 3 different accounts of explaining it. In my paper that was published with IJPR, I go over 2 different accounts. One of them is a metaphysical necessity account, and then the other one is a kind of earlier than account. So the state and existence of the substance at the time immediately prior to the time that we're considering is that which explains, either causally or otherwise, the existence of the substance in the present, in conjunction, of course, with there being no sufficiently causally destructive factor operative on it. And, there's, like I said, the metaphysical necessity account, and there are other accounts as well. Gill, right, he recognizes this. He says, yes, they have metaphysical accounts, but they bottom out in just because. Okay, I mean, so does any account of persistence. We're all going to have to hit an explanatory bedrock, right? This isn't an objection against existential inertia. It literally afflicts everyone, right? As I point out in my paper, like, we're going to hit a primitive or a metaphysical bedrock, something that explains other things without itself having a further, deeper explanation. Right? We're going to have that on any account of persistence, and hence it's simply false to say that existential inertia is somehow ruled out or defeated or gains any probabilistic disadvantage by bottoming out in quote-unquote just because answer. Again, because the theist is going to have that as well. So, I mean, if you're going to say, oh, well, God causes things to exist, but, that's just going to raise the further question, well, hold on a second, well, then why does God exist, right? And there's going to be no deeper, no further thing that you can adduce apart from God himself that can explain why God exists. And so you're just going to either have to accept self-explanation, which I think is incoherent, and I've discussed that elsewhere in, for instance, my discussion on Devil's Advocate debate on Capturing Christianity with Randall Rouser, or you're just going to have to end in something that is simply unexplained. And in that case, it's a just because. Well, and even in the case of self-explanation, right, there's a question of like, yes, but why is it self-explaining? Which is, in turn, just going to be a just because. So we're all going to bottom out in a just because. This isn't an objection against existential inertia, and no, it doesn't give a presumption in favor of divine conservation, precisely because this afflicts every single account. And I actually point out in my IJPR paper that actually the divine conservation thesis has even more just becauses than the existential inertia thesis. We're going to have to bottom out in this on any account, and as I argue in my paper, it's actually going to, arguably, there are going to be more just becauses under the divine conservation thesis, and hence, far from giving a presumption in favor of divine conservation, at best, this is a draw, and at worst, as I argue in my IJPR paper, it actually favors existential inertia. So those 3 arguments were part of Gill's opening gambit, as it were. I don't think that they succeed, and, let's move on to some of their other objections. Okay, so next I want to discuss Suan's points based on simplicity, because this is the next kind of criticism that the individuals in the video go over.
And real quick too, I mean, Gil mentioned, I think it was Opie's argument or even Joe's argument, right? Like about positing less causal entities or whatever, right? Like their picture is simpler, right? But if we frame the debate in that light, then, if we, as divine conservationists, we just posit one fundamental supreme reality that sustains everything. That seems to be simpler than, Opie's simples, maybe. I don't know.
So while I think it is definitely an interesting and valuable proposal, I don't think that it's quite right, what Suan was just mentioning there. So first, regarding Opie's view there, or I should say proposed or kind of tentative view, right? Oftentimes, I've talked actually personally with Oppie about this, that he views a lot of these YouTube discussions really as ways to test certain ideas that are sort of on the forefront of his thinking. And so oftentimes he's kind of just putting out proposals just for the sake of kind of experimentation, right? And so in his discussion with Phaser, he was sort of just bringing it up as a kind of tentative proposal, not a considered view that he has. From what I'm aware of, again, I could be wrong about this because I haven't read every single one of his papers, of course not, but from what I'm aware of, I don't think he's published on this at all. But, I could be mistaken on that because I haven't read everything that he's published. But hopefully I have a representative sample to make that, determination. But anyway, that's just a minor point. And again, I'm not accusing Suan of saying that this is Oppie's definitive view. I'm not accusing Suan of that, of course. I just want, for the audience, I want you guys to appreciate that, first of all, this is not really Oppie's view as such. It was kind of a tentative proposal that he was considering ex hypothesi in the discussion with Phaser. Second of all, on Oppie, if I were to recommend stuff to Oppie himself, I would say he doesn't need a multiplicity of physical simples. He can simply make do with one quantum field, say, or one initial singularity. But if he wants a kind of a necessary being, not in the sense of just existing in all possible worlds at some time or other, as his initial singularity does, but if he also wants something that is a necessary being even in the sense of existing at all times in all possible worlds, then he can go with the quantum field that persists through time and is just this singular, metaphysically necessary, fundamental or foundational layer to reality. That's just one proposal that he might make do with. So he wouldn't need that multiplicity of physical simples, and hence theism wouldn't have an advantage here in terms of simplicity. Now, the third thing on simplicity is that I think Suan has overlooked qualitative or categorical simplicity, which is kind of simplicity that really matters in metaphysics. So qualitative or categorical simplicity is just simplicity or having less kind of fundamental kinds within your ontology, or fundamental categories of things, right? And so, it is a bit difficult to spell out what precisely a kind or category is, but, God is supposed to be radically transcendent, and whatever he is, he's, at least under classical theism, he's certainly categorically and very qualitatively different from anything in the natural world that Oppie would recognize as existent. And so even if Oppie had these plurality of physical simples or natural simples, it's still of the same kind as, the entities of our experience, natural, physical, spatiotemporal, limited things. And so Oppie's view has a kind of qualitative or categorical simplicity, kind of uniformity there, whereas even if he doesn't have the quantitative simplicity because he has the plurality of physical simples, right? Whereas on theism, even if they only have one source of all, right, it still has a disadvantage with respect to qualitative or categorical simplicity, because not only do they have this category of natural stuff, or physical, limited, bounded spatiotemporal stuff, they also have this completely qualitatively and categorically different kind of entity in their ontology. And so I think, again, I don't think Suan's points here have too much force in my estimation. And then the fourth thing on simplicity is that arguably, even if we ignore qualitative simplicity, because it is kind of difficult to spell out what we mean by these categories, Oppie's view will probably have an advantage on simplicity. And I say see the next slide, so I'm guessing I should probably see the next slide. So if we don't like talk of categories and qualitative simplicity, we could just talk about what exists. Like, let's talk about what exists, baby. Let's talk about you and, okay, that was, ooh. Let's talk about ontology. So as Oppie likes to construe things, or Graham as I say it in this slide, he'll go on to say something like, if we look at the ontologies of naturalism and theism, if we're just looking at what exists, right, naturalism will just have basically an overlapping ontology with theism. The entire natural world, what in theism God would be creating, minus the creator, minus God, right? And so naturalism would have x1 through x5. Again, these are just kind of, we can suppose that x1 through x5 are just ontological items, things that have being, reality, or existence, or whatever. And we can suppose that they are exhaustive ontological items that naturalists commit to, like the ones that theists take to be part of creation, right? And by contrast, theism will have all the ones included in the naturalist camp plus God. And so according to this account, the ontological commitments of naturalism are a proper subset of those of theism, meaning that naturalism is simpler than theism, right? Or right, I mean, perhaps it would be better to analyze it like so, where you can see on the second part of the screen here, where C of x of n means that xn is contingent, and n of xn means that xn is necessary. And so naturalism, Oppie's naturalism at least, could have, if we just suppose that there are only 5 things in existence now, obviously, it's going to be many more than that, but Oppie's naturalism would plausibly have 4 contingent things and 1 necessary thing, x5. But theism would have all those things, x1, x2, x3, x4, x5, but they would disagree on the modal status of x5. They would hold that it's contingent, and then they would add an additional entity, right? And that would be God, right? And so again, even in this account, right, naturalism seems to edge out on simplicity. Really, the thought really here is that let's just ignore categorical or qualitative simplicity, because, natural and supernatural, these categories is difficult to define. The thought really is that the set of naturalistic commitments is the list of everything that the naturalist thinks exists, anything outside of which is not existent, right? And hence, given that the theistic God was not within the original naturalistic set, right? I mean, the naturalist set is indeed incompatible with theism, since we're supposing that the X's are non-God things. The set of things that the naturalist commits to is, again, a proper subset to that of theism, namely all the non-God, say, spatio-temporal things or natural things or something like that, whereas theism includes all of those non-God, spatio-temporal, limited things plus God, right? Here's how Graham, I think, would plausibly think about this and how he would respond. Like, listen, like, we both, the divine conservationist and the existential inertialist, if we're taking Oppie to have a kind of fundamental entitative existential inertia thesis, and we're just going to take him to have one fundamental quantum field, right, that persists inertially, we could say that, listen, both the inertialist and the conservationist think that, the physical reality has some sort of layer that's, let's say, this quantum field, right? So we both have this limited physical entity in our ontology, right? And we also agree on the spatio-temporal things that are less fundamental within our ontology, right? And so Graham Oppie would say that he's just going to identify the necessary foundation with this ontological item that is in both ontologies, right? And so we just take all this thing's properties, but then we include necessary existence as an additional one. Now, by contrast, the conservationist includes an additional ontological item, ontologically and or temporally prior to the limited physical, quantum underlying entity, right? The quantum foundation that Oppie's going to have on his view, right? And that, of course, is, under theism, this additional ontological item is God, right? And so what we have here is that the conservationist still has this quantum field in their ontology, right, as does the naturalist. But of course, the theist is going to treat it as contingent, whereas God is necessary. So, I mean, if we look at the ontological inventory of the inertialist and the conservationist, right, they agree on the existence of everything in the spatio-temporal physical world, including that, the fundamental quantum reality, right? But the theist is going to say that that thing is contingent and created by God, whereas Oppie's going to say, no, that's the necessary foundation. But, and here's the rub, right? The theist includes an additional ontological item in their inventory of what exists that Oppie doesn't, namely something prior to this quantum field that produced it or, accounts for it further. And that is a necessarily existing foundational God, right? And so they have the same ontological commitments except for the fact that theism has an additional entity. And again, both the naturalist and the theist think plausibly that there is some, at least index to the physical world, there is some fundamental physical thing, like we have good, plausibly there isn't going to be some sort of infinitely descending chain of further and further constituting relations. Well, one reason being is that is a kind of per se chain, right? This is a kind of derivative chain. And so per the classical theist's own kind of arguments for classical theism, that's not going to be able to regress infinitely. So really, the naturalist and the theist in this case, they have the same ontological commitments, except for the fact that the theist includes an additional entity, right? Now you might be thinking, oh, well, the theist doesn't have to include this quantum field in their ontology. Well, no, actually, really, this quantum field is just a placeholder for what, everyone's going to agree is at least at the fundamental layer of physical reality, right? Whether it's at the layer of reality as such is a further metaphysical question. But both the theist and the naturalist are going to be fine with the results of physics that tell us whether or not, it's particles down there, or maybe it's structure down there, or maybe it's quantum fields down there, or what have you, right? We're all going to agree on that aspect of our ontology. It's just that Abhi's going to say, now that is the foundation. There's nothing further. That is the necessary foundation. Whereas a theist is going to agree that that's in the ontology, because that's literally what physics is going to be telling us. But they're going to say, in addition to that, there's also God, the foundation that underlies whatever is fundamental with respect to the physical realm. The naturalist theory here at least seems simpler, right? We both bottom out, both the naturalist and the theist bottom out in a necessary being, but the theist has one additional ontological item that the naturalist doesn't. And so we can, of course, debate whether something physical could be necessarily existent, but that's a separate point from the present one concerning simplicity, right? And so I don't think that first of all, the multiplicity problem poses any problem because of categorical and qualitative simplicity, but even if we ignored that point, say because we have qualms about categorical and qualitative simplicity in defining natural, we can just, give an inventory of what exists, and naturalism will simply be a proper subset of theism and be simpler in virtue of that, arguably. So that's probably how Abhi would go about responding to that. I did just want to articulate that on behalf of Abhi because he was mentioned, and I think Abhi's a cool dude, so. Okay, another criticism of, me in particular, I guess not me as a person, but my article, was that Christopher said that Joe made a, quote, really bad mischaracterization, end quote, of divine conservation in the video. No, I didn't. And ironically, this is a mischaracterization of me, or at least my paper. So note first that my intention of that section was not to argue. I'm actually going to use this so we can follow along together. So my intent in that section was not to argue that divine conservation as such has trouble accounting for diachronic identity. And so it's not correct to say that I mischaracterized divine conservation, because instead my intent was to argue that Phaser's divine conservation, in the context of the Aristotelian proof, has trouble accounting for diachronic identity. Right? So it's not true that I was even characterizing divine conservation to begin with. I was not characterizing divine conservation as such. My intent was to argue that Phaser's divine conservation in the context of the Aristotelian proof has trouble accounting for diachronic identity. Now, if you don't believe me, well, you should. So look, here I'm quite explicit that I'm explicitly considering Phaser's TST as an account of persistence. And I talk about Phaser's account, I go on to say on Phaser's account, and I go on to repeatedly say this. Now, I do want to emphasize, of course, for the audience, was that my point about the diachronic identity in there was only intended as a confession of personal sight, as evinced by things like saying, I didn't say TST cannot account for it. I said it is unclear that TST can account for it. And then I also said things like prima facie Phaser's account entails X and X. Or I also say it may even threaten persistence, things like that. I don't say it does in fact decisively threaten persistence. And again, I should specify that I'm not accusing Christopher of saying that I said these things. Again, like I said right here, this is an emphasis for the audience for this little part. And then also I said it seems to lack the resources for accounting for persistence. So it seems pretty clear to me right now that my intention here is pretty clearly a confession of personal sight, given the tentativeness of my wording in that section. And then I actually then go on to grant the conservationist can account for diachronic identity if, say, they adopt transtemporal causal relations, say. But then I make a dialectical point in response to this adoption. I say, well, if you're going to allow transtemporal causal relations there, then why not allow transtemporal causal relations to account for the persistence of something, and hence we don't need to adduce some sort of concurrent sustaining cause. That was a dialectical point. You can read the paper for more. I'm not trying to defend that dialectical point right now. I'm just trying to say that I do not make the claim that conservationism as such cannot account for persistence. And right now, I'm of course not saying that Christopher said that I said that, right? I mean, we're getting into like this matrix sort of stuff. But Christopher's claim here that I made a really bad mischaracterization of divine conservation is simply false, because I wasn't trying to characterize divine conservation at all, and I never claimed to. And in fact, I explicitly claimed the opposite. I talked about Feser's divine conservation in the context of the Aristotelian proof. Now, Christopher did go on to say that Joe is, quote, not just wrong, but really wrong, end quote, with respect to my argument there, and talking about how God, continuously recreates the universe under Feser's account. So he says, quote, God doesn't continuously recreate. He conserves the same creature from time to time, or over time, end quote. Now, again, ironically, this criticism of me is, quote, not just wrong, but really wrong, end quote. Why? Well, because it simply fails to consider that I'm tackling Feser's account of conservation in the context of the Aristotelian proof. And Feser is absolutely explicit that any non-God substance, at any moment at which it exists, reduces at that moment from potency to act in respect of its existence. It transitions from potency to act in respect of its existence, even at any moment at which it exists. And God is the ultimate actualizer of this at each and every moment. And so it is this continual reduction from potency to act and reactualization of said potential that is relevantly analogous to continuous recreation. So, it's mainly deriving from the absolute requirement for Feser's argument to succeed. He needs it to be the case, and it's explicitly contained in one of his premises, that any changeable substance whatsoever, at any moment at which it exists, literally reduces from potentially existent to actually existent. And that kind of continual re-reduction from potency to act and reactualization on God's part of said potential, that seems almost quite clearly to be a case of continuously kind of reactualizing the potential in question. Christopher quotes me here. I say, but now consider Feser's TST as an account of persistence. Now, prima facie, this account is almost identical to the scenario involving the replacement of, a pastel painting. Now, on Feser's account, God does not act on a previously existent concrete object to conserve it in existence, preserving its original constituents, and instead God wholly reconstitutes concrete objects from utter non-being at each and every moment. For Feser, at each moment, non-God concrete objects transition from potency to act with respect to their very existence, and at each moment God is the ultimate actualizer of such transitions. Now, Christopher says, I'm not sure where we got that from, and, Gil and Suan kind of nod emphatically. Now, where did I get it? Well, literally the man himself, Edward Feser. Now, I first want to say that, like, wholly reconstitute and so on, like, those are, that's a rhetorical flair to make my point. The fundamental point concerns the last sentence in that quote. For Feser, at each moment, non-God concrete objects transition from potency to act with respect to the very being or existence, and at each moment, God is the ultimate actualizer of such transitions. So the fundamental point here concerns that last sentence in the quote, namely the transition from potency to act in respect of the very being or existence of each changeable substance at any moment at which it exists. Now, Christopher then asks where I got this from. Well, literally Feser himself. So let's look at the claim, okay? So I'm just going to call this the claim, okay? The claim says that anything with any potency whatsoever transitions from potentially existent to actually existent at any moment at which it exists. I reduces from potency to act in respect of its very being or existence at each moment of its existence. Now, notice this is just identical to this last sentence. Now, as I will argue, Feser's Aristotelian proof strictly requires this, and hence, when he asks me where I'm getting this from, well, it's literally Feser himself. I'm going to argue that Feser's Aristotelian proof strictly requires this, entails this, presupposes this, and that Feser is quite explicit on it. So let me allow me to explain. Now, Feser's argument crucially relies on the claim, okay? For only under the claim can we infer that every changeable, that is to say non-purely actual or act potency composite being, concurrently depends for its existence on a purely actual actualizer of its existence, given, one, the causal principle that Feser uses, namely, that whatever reduces from potency to act is caused to do so by something already actual, and two, the view that any per se chain of actualizations must terminate in a per se cause of such a chain. Okay? So only if the claim is true will we be able to infer a purely actual actualizer given what Feser wants to use to infer that, namely the causal principle and the finitude of per se chains. So here's a demonstration that the Aristotelian proof crucially relies on the claim. So suppose that the claim is false, that is, that there is, or could be, a changeable being that is not transitioning from potency to act in respect of its existence? Well, the Aristotelian proof causal principle only demands a concurrent sustaining actualizer when there is such a transition, right? That causal principle only states that whatever reduces or transitions from potency to act requires an actualizer, right? And so in order to infer that something requires a causal actualizer, only using this principle, we have to state that it does in fact transition from potency to act. And so, right, if we suppose that the claim is false, that is, that there is or genuinely could be a changeable being that is not transitioning from potency to act in respect of its existence, well then, since the Aristotelian proof, since its causal principle only demands a concurrent actualizer, sustaining actualizer, when there is such a transition, it would follow that the causal principle employed would not demand, justify, or require a concurrent actualizing cause of the existence of such a thing, namely a changeable being that is not transitioning from potency to act in respect of its existence. Hence, for all the argument would show or justify, such a being would or could be an act-potency composite object that exists without requiring a sustaining cause of its existence. And let's just call such objects of this sort unsustained composites, okay? So if we deny the claim, then we allow there to be unsustained composites, unsustained composite objects of act-potency composite objects, assuming that we're only working with Feser's causal principle, that whatever reduces from potency to act requires an actualizer, which is precisely what we can assume in this dialectical context when we're talking about the Aristotelian proof, okay? But if that's true, if there are such unsustained, or there could be such unsustained act-potency composites, then the inference from the finitude of per se causal chains to a purely actual being is simply undermined. It is precisely because any act-potency composite would require a sustaining cause that the first unsustained member of any such per se chain would have to be purely actual. By contrast, if unsustained composites are genuinely possible, then the terminus of a per se chain of causal sustenance of other act-potency composite objects need not be a purely actual being, but could instead be an unsustained composite. And hence it follows that Feser's argument crucially relies on the claim, since the negation of the claim leads to a defeater of the argument. Namely, we can't infer that the first member is purely actual. The fundamental thing to realize is that Feser's causal principle, the one that he is adducing in this proof, is the causal principle according to which whatever reduces or transitions from potency to act requires an actualizer, okay? Now, in order to apply that to the moment-by-moment existence of concrete objects, right, concrete changeable objects, then he simply has to hold that their moment-by-moment existence is such that it consists in a reduction from potentially existent to actually existent. Why? Because if it didn't so consist in a reduction from potency to act in respect of its existence, then the causal principle that he employs is utterly irrelevant. Why? Because the causal principle, again, only applies to things that do so transition from potency to act, right? And so his proof literally requires it to be the case that any changeable thing, at any moment at which it exists, reduces from potentially existent to actually existent, or transitions from potency in being to act in being. I mean, if you look at his premise 7, he says that the existence of S, right, where S is a changeable substance, it's an act-potency composite object, at any given moment itself presupposes the concurrent actualization of S's potential for existence. So here Feser is explicit that there is an actualization of this said potential at any moment at which S exists. And this actualization is it's actualizing the substance's existence at any moment. It is such that it is causing it to reduce from potency to act, again, precisely because his causal principle states that whatever reduces from potency to act requires such actualization. So, long story short, where did I get this from? Well, the man himself, Ed Feser. Now, obviously, Feser didn't say wholly reconstitutes, but he is talking about utter non-being, because he's talking about the very being of the substances in question. And he's explicitly talking about them reducing from potency to act with respect to their very being. And so, yeah, Feser's quite explicit about this. It's explicit in one of his premises. It's required in order for his argument to succeed, because that's the only way you can apply the causal principle that he uses to the act-potency composites at any moment at which they exist, with respect to their being, that is. So then Gil went on to say that what I said was, quote, "It is so obviously wrong that I think he must have been reading another book," end quote. Like, I could say some negative things here, but I'm not going to. I'm just going to leave these memes on here, and I'm just going to, I'm just going to base my response on what I just previously articulated as to why Phaser is quite explicit that any changeable substance is such that it reduces at any moment at which it exists. It literally reduces or transitions from potency to act in respect of its very being or existence. And hence there is a continual re-reduction from potency to act and a continual re-actualization of said potential under Phaser's account in the context of Phaser's Aristotelian proof. This is my face. This is my face. This is literally it. Gill goes on to say, like, in order to think this, namely in order to think of my objection, you'd have to think that God does something analogous to God pushes something, then for a second he stops, and then he pushes something, then for a second he stops. No, that is not what the objection would require, or it wouldn't even have anything like analogous to that. It's not as though God's like withholding his sustaining power, or like creating and then not creating and then creating and then not creating and then creating it. No, it's rather simply follows from an analysis of Phaser's own Aristotelian proof that things, at any moment at which they exist, reduce from potency to act in respect of their existence, and hence, even at that single moment, require that God actualizes them and causes that reduction from potency to act. And this happens at every single moment. So it's a sort of re-reduction from potency to act in respect of its very being or existence, and God is re-actualizing that. I mean, this is just what Phaser's argument requires. This doesn't require God to, like, create and then kind of hold off for a sec, and then, like, create and then hold off for a sec. Like, no, all it requires is, like, a kind of continual, so it can still be continuous, but it's continual reactualization and continual re-reduction from potency to act. Anyway, so I'm gonna stop here. I'm about halfway through. I'll do a part 2. You can expect the part 2 maybe within the next 5 days or so, maybe even less, depending upon how motivated I am, which is usually a function of how triggered I am. But yeah, thank you, Christopher. Thank you, Gil. Thank you, Suan, for engaging my work. I mean, everything I say here is in, good faith and good fun. I did get a little bit riled up there at the end, but hopefully you can start to appreciate, at least why I got riled up. And hopefully the audience can certainly see why that is the case. So I'll do a part 2, and I'm Joe Schmid. This is The Majesty of Reason, and peace out.